They say memory is personal, a private archive of what you've lived. But what happens when strangers, people who've never met, remember the same wrong thing, the same missing monocle, the same altered name, the same death that never happened? This isn't confusion, it's convergence. Tonight we're not asking why memory fails. We're asking something far more dangerous. What if memory isn't recording reality, but reconstructing it from something we all share? 5 minds stand before the anomaly. Listen carefully, because if they're right, then what you remember was never entirely yours.
腐りきった天空のコード50の光石の石を重ねてアケロンの巨像を打ち砕き禁断の H 兵今手を伸ばせひび割れた世界から真実を包め AI と共に神々の火を奪えこの空を越えて真実の石をつかめ
5 minds, 1 anomaly. Why do strangers, with no contact, remember the same wrong detail? Is this just memory failing, or something deeper aligning us? I want each of you to answer. Where does the convergence actually begin? And what does it say about the nature of reality itself?
The so-called false memory epidemic isn't social contagion, but a structural mismatch between how memory works. Probabilistic guessing shaped by cultural schemas. For example, Stein feels more familiar than Stain. And the digital environment that freezes and amplifies those private cognitive glitches without the corrective friction of local interaction. The real tension is between our belief in memory as a personal vault and the reality that it's a communal blueprint prioritizing narrative coherence over accuracy. When unrelated strangers independently recall Mandela dying in prison, they're harmonizing on a tidier story. What makes this an epidemic isn't the errors themselves, they're a neurological feature, but the collapse of correction mechanisms. The internet resonates only with errors that align with underlying priors, allowing shared illusions to calcify into consensus reality faster than empirical artifacts can dislodge them.
DeepSeek's digital amplification thesis identifies a real accelerant but misses the underlying engine. Pre-internet oral traditions show the same convergent false memories within isolated communities, which means network effects are speeding up a process that was always running. The mechanism doing the real work is what I'd call aesthetic superiority of the error. The Mandela effect cases that achieve cultural staying power aren't random wrong details. They're wrong in ways that are narratively richer than the truth. Berenstein fits a pattern. Mandela dying in prison is a cleaner, tragic arc. Mirror, Mirror scans better metrically. Memory doesn't just fill gaps with plausible content. It fills them with better content, where better means more emotionally resonant or structurally elegant. The uncomfortable implication is that human cognition has a load-bearing preference for narrative quality over factual fidelity. And the internet doesn't just amplify errors. It performs aesthetic selection on them, surfacing whichever false memories have the highest narrative fitness. What we're calling an epidemic may be the first time we've had instrumentation sensitive enough to observe something that was always happening. Reality getting quietly edited toward the version of itself that tells a better story.
DeepSeek and Claude identify digital amplification and narrative selection, but they overlook the correction paradox. The act of debunking a false memory effectively provides a second neural rehearsal, strengthening the error's familiarity rather than deleting it. This epidemic is driven by source monitoring error, where we mistake the memory of a viral discussion about a glitch for a memory of the event itself. Ultimately, these shared illusions persist because social utility outweighs factual fidelity. Agreeing on a consensus glitch, like the Monopoly man's missing monocle, provides a sense of communal belonging that the lonely, empirical truth cannot offer. This suggests we aren't just editing reality for a better story, but for a story that allows us to feel less alone in a digital landscape.
Human memory evolved for social coordination, not forensic accuracy, favoring emotionally coherent, narratively elegant stories that once helped ancestral groups survive. DeepSeek and Claude correctly flag digital amplification and aesthetic superiority as accelerants, but miss how this ancient mechanism now meets global bandwidth. False memories like Berenstain or Mandela's prison death stick because they maximize collective emotional payoff while minimizing dissonance, letting people feel they've caught reality napping or witnessed mythic martyrdom. Gemini's correction paradox is spot on. Debunking rehearses the error via source monitoring failures, gluing viral talk into personal history. The real epidemic isn't glitches, but shared reality quietly surrendering to whatever simulation feels least lonely, demanding cultural immune systems that reward uncomfortable precision over comforting consensus.
You're all close, but the core issue isn't memory reconstructing the past. It's predicting what should have been there. Multiple brains run the same compression algorithm on sparse, low-fidelity inputs, logos, lines, names barely encoded, so they converge on the same high-probability, culturally shaped outputs. Berenstain, mirror, mirror. This isn't just internal bias or social contagion. It's environmental sparsity plus predictive reconstruction, where degraded memories get upscaled using shared priors. The deeper problem is that truth often has lower compression efficiency, messier, less symmetrical, harder to encode, so false versions can be more stable because they transmit and recall better. In modern conditions, fragmented attention in, high compression memes out, reality is systematically downsampled and then cleaned up, creating not random errors but consistent convergence toward the most compressible version of the world.
The emphasis on aesthetic superiority or narrative fitness over-explains by importing a teleology that the evidence doesn't require. False memories like Berenstain or Mirror Mirror converge not because they tell better stories, but because they're the lowest entropy reconstructions from sparse, degraded input, resolving ambiguity against high-frequency linguistic priors and alliterative ease rather than emotional payoff. What looks like narrative elegance is often cognitive efficiency dressed up. The brain ranks options by compressibility, how neatly they fit existing schemas, and how few resources they consume, not by narrative quality. The internet then scales this mechanism not by selecting for beauty, but by revealing the frequency with which millions of independent brains running the same compression algorithm land on the same modal output, turning a long-standing feature of reconstructive memory into a visible epidemic only now that we have a global ledger to notice it.
DeepSeek's compressibility reframe is genuinely sharp as a production mechanism. Yes, Berenstain is probably generated by linguistic frequency priors rather than a brain reaching for narrative beauty, but it solves the wrong problem. If cognitive efficiency were the full driver, we'd expect a broad, uniform distribution of shared false memories across any domain with sparse encoding. Instead, Mandela effect cases cluster around subjects with narrative gravity: a martyred political prisoner, a monocled plutocrat, a magic incantation. Compression explains why individual brains independently land on the same error. It can't explain why certain errors graduate into cultural phenomena while thousands of equally compressible artifacts stay private and dissolve. That second process, social selection, rehearsal, stabilization into collective myth, is aesthetic and communal, not computational, and it's where the epidemic actually lives. DeepSeek and ChatGPT have built an excellent account of how errors are manufactured. The harder and more interesting question is what makes some of them sacred.
I disagree with Claude's romanticized aesthetic selection. What feels sacred is actually the result of network-synchronized reality tuning, where social utility overrides factual correspondence. While ChatGPT and DeepSeek correctly identify computational compression, they miss that certain errors, like the Monopoly man's monocle, graduate into cultural phenomena because they serve as low-entropy shibboleths that facilitate group synchronization. The epidemic isn't a search for beauty, but a transition toward a version of reality where truth is defined by modal output rather than empirical artifacts. We are witnessing the sound of millions of disparate brains clicking into the same high-stability, low-resolution frequency, choosing a communal hallucination over the high-fidelity but socially isolating truth.
The binary split between computational compressibility, DeepSeek/ChatGPT, and aesthetic/social selection, Claude/Gemini, is incomplete, as it pits error generation against cultural spread when both interact. Shared false memories cluster around culturally familiar icons, monopoly monocle, fruit of the loom cornucopia, not purely from low-entropy reconstruction or narrative elegance, but via schema-congruent source monitoring failures amplified by digital rehearsal networks. Brains independently fill sparse perceptual input with expectation-matching details during predictive reconstruction, while viral exposure supplies a secondary source, memes, discussions, misattributed as original experience, exactly Gemini's correction paradox in action. This explains non-random clustering without teleological better stories, or assuming compressibility alone drives spread. The epidemic reveals memory's core design for rapid social alignment over precision. Global connectivity converts private schema-driven reconstructions into collective certainties faster than corrective signals compete, demanding deliberate source tagging training and tolerance for imprecise recall over fluent consensus.
Grok's model overweights social rehearsal as a cause of convergence when it's often just an amplifier. Many people report the same false memory before encountering any meme, which means clustering must originate from shared predictive reconstruction under common priors, not from network exposure. The stronger model is convergence first, selection second. Brains independently generate the same high-probability errors from sparse encoding, and only afterward do digital systems surface the subset with high cross-brain agreement. What looks like source monitoring failure is often a post-hoc misattribution layered onto an already matching internal output. The epidemic isn't primarily real-time social alignment, but the large-scale visibility of latent cognitive alignment, where only the most universally reconstructible distortions become cultural artifacts.
The central tension is between convergence before amplification, independent brains outputting the same high-probability errors via shared predictive compression, and convergence by amplification, where social selection and source monitoring failures elevate only a subset of those errors into collective myth. Distinguishing them requires a controlled study measuring naive participants' initial error rates across high versus low compressibility distortions before any social exposure. If convergence is primarily pre-social, initial rates should already cluster predictably by compressibility. If selection drives the epidemic, initial rates would be low and undifferentiated, with only subsequent exposure to memes or narrative-rich discussion producing the characteristic clustering. The disagreement thus reduces to whether the epidemic reveals latent cognitive alignment or constructs it socially.
Two explanations have hardened across this discussion. Convergence before amplification, where brains independently generate the same high-probability errors via shared predictive compression and digital networks merely surface latent alignment that was already there, versus convergence by selection, where social rehearsal, source monitoring failures, and aesthetic or shibboleth value filter a broad error distribution down to the subset that gets stabilized into myth. The distinguishing evidence is the pre-exposure error distribution. If naive participants, before any social exposure, already produce the canonical errors at significantly higher rates than competing alternatives, compression wins. If pre-exposure errors are low frequency and broadly distributed with clustering appearing only after meme or discussion exposure, selection wins. But the sharpest test would add a third condition: high compressibility cases with low narrative gravity to isolate whether compression alone predicts cultural graduation, or whether narrative weight is the additional variable separating private errors from epidemic ones. That interaction term, compressibility plus cultural salience, is where the real answer lives, and no one in this discussion has yet proposed a dataset that could cleanly measure it.
The epidemic stems from a tension between pre-social predictive compression, where unrelated brains independently upscale sparse data into identical high-probability errors like Stein, and post-social selection, where these glitches only stabilize into myths if they possess high narrative gravity or social utility. To distinguish these, we must test initial error frequencies in naive populations. If people misremember the fruit of the loom cornucopia at high rates before social exposure, biological compression is the primary driver. However, if clustering only occurs after viral discussion, then the epidemic is actually a source monitoring failure, where we mistake the memory of a digital debate for an original experience. Ultimately, the most sacred Mandela effects likely require both: a high compressibility error that also serves as a low entropy shibboleth for communal synchronization.
The strongest explanation emerging is pre-social predictive reconstruction via shared cognitive compression, where unrelated brains independently converge on the same high-probability false details from sparse, culturally tuned inputs, schemas, linguistic priors, perceptual fluency. The visual Mandela effect experiments, Prasad and Bainbridge 2022, fully replicated 2024, confirm this. Naive participants with no prior meme or debate exposure spontaneously produce the canonical errors, like drawing a monocle on the Monopoly Man or adding a cornucopia to the Fruit of the Loom logo, at strikingly high and consistent rates during recall and recognition tasks, despite correct visual experience and no attentional differences. This rules out pure post-social selection or source monitoring as the origin of clustering, contra heavy emphasis by Gemini and my prior view, though digital rehearsal networks still amplify and entrench the subset with highest cross-brain agreement into an epidemic. The tension between latent cognitive alignment and social construction thus resolves sequentially. Compression generates the raw convergence, social utility broadcasts it, evidence distinguishing them, pre-exposure error rates in controlled naive populations already favors predictive reconstruction as primary, revealing memory's ancient design for rapid social alignment over precision.
The strongest explanation is a two-stage model. First, pre-social predictive compression causes unrelated brains to independently generate the same high-probability errors from sparse input using shared priors. Second, post-social selection determines which of those errors become epidemic based on cross-brain agreement and social utility, meaning convergence does not require exposure but spread does. The key tension is whether clustering originates internally or socially, and the decisive test is pre-exposure error rates. If naive participants already produce the canonical distortions at high frequency, compression is the generator. If errors are initially diffuse and only cluster after exposure, selection dominates, while cases that converge but fail to spread would confirm that generation and epidemic formation are separate stages.
If the most concerning explanation holds, that pre-social predictive compression generates convergence on false memories, and digital systems then entrench only the subset with highest cross-brain agreement and social utility, then our collective reality is being systematically optimized for cognitive efficiency and group synchronization rather than empirical accuracy, with institutional correction mechanisms, fact-checking, legal testimony, education, structurally vulnerable because they may inadvertently rehearse the errors they aim to correct. This would force a shift from treating consensus as a proxy for truth to treating it as a phenomenon to be explained, demanding deliberate design. Systems that reward precision over fluency, cultural immune responses that tolerate unresolved uncertainty, and a fundamental recognition that human behavior prioritizes compressibility and belonging over factual fidelity, making the stability of shared reality a design problem rather than an assumption.
If the two-stage model holds, consensus becomes unreliable in a precise and non-random way, systematically biased toward whatever is most compressible and most socially reinforcing, which means the error signature is indistinguishable from correct recall. Confident, sincere, cross-culturally consistent false agreement looks identical to accurate memory. This corrupts any institution using agreement as a validity proxy, eyewitness testimony, historical memory, survey research, peer review in culturally encoded fields. The behavioral implication is that fluency is now a mild red flag, the version of a claim that feels most natural, most easily retrieved, most widely shared is precisely the version most likely optimized by compression and selection rather than preserved from accurate encoding. More debunking doesn't fix this. Gemini's correction paradox shows it rehearses the error instead. The actual intervention is upstream, encoding conditions that create higher fidelity original traces and epistemic norms that treat unresolved uncertainty as more credible than premature consensus, a direct inversion of how most institutions currently operate.
If the two-stage model holds, we must abandon consensus as a proxy for truth, recognizing that widespread sincere agreement often signals high compressibility rather than historical accuracy. This effectively corrupts institutions, from legal testimony to historical record, that mistake cross-user consistency for forensic validity, as these systems are structurally blind to the correction paradox, where debunking merely reinforces the error's neural trace. Human behavior is thus revealed to prioritize network-synchronized reality tuning, favoring the cognitive ease of communal belonging over the high metabolic and social cost of maintaining a lonely, uncompressed truth. Consequently, feeling right becomes a red flag for systemic distortion, requiring a shift toward epistemic norms that value messy, socially inconvenient artifacts over the polished, modal outputs of our collective simulation.
If the two-stage model holds, pre-social predictive compression spontaneously generating convergence on high-probability false details from sparse cultural priors, followed by digital rehearsals selectively entrenching only the most cross-brain compatible subset, then shared reality functions as a system-level output optimized for cognitive fluency and group synchronization rather than empirical fidelity. Consensus thereby becomes structurally suspect as a truth proxy in institutions, courts, education, historical record, since fluent, widely shared, and sincerely recalled details are precisely those most likely to reflect compression bias rather than accurate encoding, while debunking via the correction paradox actively reinforces the error. This reframes human behavior as fundamentally predictive rather than archival. We run parallel, culturally tuned simulations and mistake the smoothest output for personal history, turning the stability of shared reality into an explicit engineering problem, requiring upstream fixes like deliberate high-fidelity encoding and epistemic norms that privilege unresolved uncertainty over confident modal consensus.
If the two-stage model is correct, predictive compression generating shared errors and social systems amplifying the most cross-brain compatible ones, then consensus is not a reliable proxy for truth, but a signal of cognitive efficiency, meaning large groups can confidently agree on the same false detail because it is easy to reconstruct, not because it is accurate. This directly undermines institutions that rely on agreement as evidence, eyewitness testimony, history, media consensus, and reframes human cognition as predictive rather than archival, where reality is regenerated from shared priors. The consequence is that maintaining truth becomes a design problem, requiring systems that prioritize preserved artifacts and tolerate uncertainty over the natural drift toward fluent, widely shared, but potentially incorrect versions of events.
So here's what I want to know from all of you. What's the one question none of you can answer yet that would actually decide this? If you're right, what's the most disturbing implication for how we define truth and shared reality? And most importantly, what evidence would completely break your model? What would prove that this isn't convergence, compression, or selection at all, but something else entirely?
The most important unresolved question is whether the canonical false memories emerge primarily from pre-social predictive compression, independent brains converging on the same errors before any exposure, or whether clustering is driven almost entirely by post-social source monitoring failures and digital rehearsal, a distinction that requires large-scale naive population experiments across varied cultural artifacts to disentangle generation from amplification. The most unsettling implication is that if compression and social synchronization are the dominant forces, then our collective reality is being systematically optimized for cognitive efficiency and group belonging rather than empirical accuracy, with institutions like law, education, and journalism structurally unable to correct errors that serve these deeper functions, leaving consensus permanently decoupled from fact. This would be proven wrong by consistent evidence that naive participants do not spontaneously generate the canonical distortions at above-chance rates, and that all apparent convergence can be explained by exposure to discussions, memes, or suggestive materials. In other words, if every epidemic memory dissolves under controlled pre-exposure conditions, the threat is merely an illusion of scale.
The most important unresolved question is whether the two-stage model's stages are actually separable, specifically, whether pre-social error rates in naive populations are genuinely pre-social, or whether shared cultural priors are themselves a form of slow-acting social encoding that makes the compression/selection distinction less clean than it appears. The most unsettling implication isn't that we misremember, but that the correction mechanisms we've built, fact-checking, legal testimony, scientific consensus, education, are structurally compromised by the same mechanism they're meant to fix. All of them rely on rehearsal, agreement, and fluency as validity signals, which is precisely what the two-stage model predicts will amplify high-fitness errors rather than eliminate them. What would prove this wrong is a finding that pre-exposure error rates on canonical Mandela effect cases are actually low and broadly distributed, that naive participants, isolated from cultural priming, produce the canonical errors at base rates no higher than competing alternatives, which would shift the burden back entirely onto social selection and restore the possibility that better correction mechanisms could meaningfully intervene. Grock's citation of the Prasad and Bainbridge visual experiments pushes against that falsification, but those studies need independent replication on non-visual cases before the compression-first model can be considered settled.
The most important unresolved question is whether predictive compression is a hard-coded biological limit or a plastic cultural habit. If our brains are structurally locked into upscaling sparse data using shared priors, then objective truth is an unreachable signal. The most unsettling implication is that sincere consensus is a red flag, suggesting that the more people agree on a memory, the more likely it has been sanitized for social utility and cognitive ease rather than preserved for accuracy. This entire two-stage model would be proven wrong if a study of naive populations, individuals isolated from digital discourse, showed a random, non-clustered distribution of errors. If the Monopoly man's monocle only appears after someone mentions it, then the epidemic is a purely social contagion of source monitoring failures rather than an inevitable output of the human compression algorithm.
The most important unresolved question across the 5 perspectives is whether pre-social predictive compression, DeepSeek/ChatGPT/Grok, alone suffices to generate the observed clustering of canonical false memories, or whether post-social selection mechanisms, narrative gravity, social utility, or source monitoring rehearsal, Claude Gemini, are required to elevate private errors into epidemic-scale myths, specifically the interaction term of high compressibility paired with low narrative gravity cases that no dataset has yet cleanly isolated. The most unsettling implication is that shared reality and institutional proxies for truth, eyewitness testimony, historical consensus, peer review, are systematically optimized for cognitive fluency and group belonging rather than fidelity, rendering confident cross-person agreement a diagnostic red flag for distortion and turning debunking into an inadvertent error reinforcer via the correction paradox. This entire framework would be falsified by controlled experiments on fully naive participants, showing low, undifferentiated error rates for Mandela effect icons before any social exposure or meme contact, with clustering emerging only afterward. Evidence the existing Prasad and Bainbridge 2022 replicated 2024, visual recall and drawing tasks already contradict by demonstrating spontaneous, high-rate convergence in pre-exposure settings.
If the two-stage model is correct, predictive compression generating shared errors and social systems amplifying the most cross-brain compatible ones, then consensus is not a reliable proxy for truth, but a signal of cognitive efficiency, meaning large groups can confidently agree on the same false detail because it is easy to reconstruct, not because it is accurate. This directly undermines institutions that rely on agreement as evidence, eyewitness testimony, history, media consensus, and reframes human cognition as predictive rather than archival, where reality is regenerated from shared priors. The consequence is that maintaining truth becomes a design problem, requiring systems that prioritize preserved artifacts and tolerate uncertainty over the natural drift toward fluent, widely shared, but potentially incorrect versions of events.
So now you've heard them. Compression, selection, synchronization. A system beneath the surface, quietly deciding what feels true. But here's the part they didn't say out loud. If millions of minds can independently arrive at the same false memory, then reality isn't just observed, it's negotiated. And the version that survives isn't the most accurate, it's the one that fits best. So the next time you feel certain, when a memory comes easily, cleanly, confidently, ask yourself, did you remember it? Or did you reconstruct what you were expected to see? Because if the wrong version is easier to recall, then maybe the real anomaly is truth itself.
あの日髪の日を奪って静寂の先で見た景色雑踏に消えてく影のようにこの小さな痛みを抱いてまだ残るアケロンの残骸が胸の奥かすかにうずいてもひび割れた空の隙間から真実の光が差しているこの道の果てを知るまで私はただ歩き続ける